Good morning, everybody. And thanks for being here for our symposium celebrating the opening of the exhibition. This is Roberto Burle Marx, A Total Work of Art is the title for today. I love that, a total work of art. I think that comes from our friend Edward Sullivan. I would say it sounds kind of Southern Californian, totally. It's a total work of art. But I'm Carrie Barrett. I'm the president and CEO of this august and, as of this week, even more beautiful institution. Some of you that I've been chatting with said you've seen the art exhibition on the 6th floor, which we have his paintings, drawings, stunning tapestry from the Art Institute of Chicago. On the 4th floor is the companion science exhibition, something that I always say only we can do, art, science, and horticulture. And the science is very important because of the work that we do in the field, in Brazil, in the Amazon, and on the coastline, the Atlantic coast of Brazil. And then finally, sort of the pièce de résistance, which you won't believe if you haven't seen it, is what used to be the very staid and beautiful lawn in front of the conservatory on the south side, surrounded by boxwood, is now, we've turned it into Rio de Janeiro, thanks to Raymond Jungles, who you'll hear from later today. There are people, it feels so natural that there were people, we had a big celebration last night, we had a press opening earlier in the week, people were like, think it's always been there, or are asking now, can you keep it this way? We'd say yes, except that it gets a little cold in October, and these trees that are so loving this warm day today, the trees and the cycads and the beautiful, beautiful tropical plants. I hope you'll all have time today after the symposium to see all of this, or to see parts of it, and then come back and enjoy. This is, in some ways, what I've just described makes Burle Marx the perfect artists on whom to do a special project. I've been here a year, and I've learned that the most successful exhibitions that we can do are the ones that are most meaningful to our communities, to our nation, if you will, are the kinds of things that only we can do. You know, we're big, robust, we're resourceful. There are plenty of institutions that can do art exhibitions, and there are plenty of institutions that can do science exhibitions, and many gardens and beautiful parks that can do, well, probably not this, probably not what we did. But what we can do is not only all three, but then do it with a kind of an excellence that I'd like to think that this man would be happy. In some ways, I'd like to think that we almost did it to please him, to honor his legacy, this incredible artist, world-class plantsman, lover of people, gregarious, friendly to all, who inculcated in everyone he knew, not just kind of that feeling of passion for the natural environment, but actually to be stewards of it, to take care of native plants, to understand biodiversity, and to help save that in this world. I'll leave my comments at that, because you have experts who will talk to you today about all of these things that I'm touching on. But part of my role is also to thank people. As I said, we're resourceful, but resourceful comes from incredible support from a variety of people. The major donors for the exhibition and this entire project are the Louester T. Mertz Charitable Trust. The Mertz Trust helps us with so many things. Their name is on this building, and they continue to help us in such valuable ways. Our chairman, Barclay Collins, who earlier this year made a challenge grant to help us pay for this great exhibition. He started his chairmanship in January and began at the podium saying, I'm raising a challenge grant to help support this exhibition and the operations of this beautiful garden. The Melville Foundation, MetLife and the MetLife Foundation, Tom and Janet Montag, the National Endowment for the Humanities, Natura, Janet Ross, Carmen and John Thane, Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation, and Bloomberg Philanthropies. We've also had additional support from the Milton and Sally Avery Arts Foundation, the EHA Foundation, Anna Maria and Stephen Kellen Foundation, Susan Lynch, Chuck and Deborah Royce, the NEA, the National Endowment for the Arts, the New York Council on the Arts, which is supported by Governor Andrew Cuomo and the New York State Legislature, so we thank our friends in Albany. We're really extremely thankful for all of these donors. On another level, we couldn't have done this project without our friends from the Consulate General of Brazil, who are here with us today. Ambassador Enio Cordeiro is here, and we are so honored by your presence. Thank you for being here. And Deputy Consul General Marco Antonio Nakata. I think I've seen Marco, it feels like every single day this week, right? Have you moved in? Like he came and we were gonna keep an office for you up here for the entire summer. Thank you so much. And we worked with so many talented people, staff across the garden, too many to name, to get a project like this off the ground. You're going to hear today from our expert garden designer, Raymond Jungles, a protege of Burleigh Marx, who envisioned and created this magnificent, lush tropical garden. It's such a pleasure to have you here. Every time that you're here, it's so much fun, brings us to life. Edward Sullivan, our distinguished professor and guest curator, who helped us illuminate Burleigh Marx's modernist impact. You'll hear from both of them today, as well as our distinguished speakers, Catherine Sevitt-Nortonson and Isabella Ono. So it's with great pleasure that I take my seat and buckle in for this wonderful morning by introducing our guest curator and moderator, Edward Sullivan, and he'll introduce the other speakers. Edward, I've known for a while from my past life at the Met. Worked right across the street from one another on days when he was teaching at the IFA, extraordinary specialists in Latin American art and fields of the arts of the Americas in general, including South America and Brazil. He's the Helen Gould Shepherd Professor of Art History, and he also serves at NYU, and he serves as Deputy Director for the Institute of Fine Arts, a very distinguished position. He's published more than 30 books and exhibition catalogs in his field. He serves on the Advisory Committee for Visual Arts of the Americas Society and on the board of the Mexican Cultural Institute of New York. It's been an extraordinary pleasure to have worked with Edward over the years that it took to pull this extraordinary exhibition together. Collaboration, again, between arts and nature, plants and paintings, and Edward has been really the glue that has kept this all together for us. So thank you very much. Enjoy the day, and welcome, Edward. Thanks.
Bom dia a todos, bem-vindos ao Jardim Botânico de Nova York e à nossa exposição sobre Roberto Burle Marx. So thank you very much for being here. It is a huge pleasure to be in this hall where I've spoken before, and I'm so grateful to Carrie Barrett, the director, and to all of my colleagues. I said the other day at our press preview that I have been a professor and I've had a parallel life as a museum curator, an independent curator, for many, many years, and I've done exhibitions in Europe and Latin America and in the United States, and I don't think I've ever had such a collegial, pleasant, and wonderful experience with all of my colleagues here at the Garden than I've had ever in my life. So I'm very, very grateful to all of you. I was so honored to be asked to curate the exhibition when my colleague and longtime friend Joanna Groark, who is the coordinator of exhibitions and public programming here at the Garden, and I think the patron saint of this exhibition, to be perfectly honest, and we all must pay homage to Joanna as well as to all of the wonderful people at the gallery and at the Garden in general. When I was asked to give my thoughts about doing a Burleigh Marx show, this is 3 years ago, I said, yes, of course, that would be fantastic. And then about a week later, I was asked to be the curator, and of course that was a huge high from which I have never come down. So thank you so much. And I also want to acknowledge the amazing book that has been done. And Joanna and I have the privilege of being the editors of this book that is available. I don't know where it's being sold, but it's here. I know that it just arrived recently. And I also want to say how important were the contributions of the writers of the book, and those are Catherine Sevitt, who is going to speak to us in just a little while, as well as Sergio Bessa, who is of the Bronx Museum, Louisa Valle, very distinguished critic and historian, and Douglas Daly, who is of the New York Botanical Garden and works all the time in the north part of Brazil near the Amazon. So this symposium will highlight a variety of themes associated with the Gardens exhibition. As moderator, I will introduce the participants, all of whom play an integral role in our effort, and then I will make my own remarks about the exhibition itself and set the stage, as it were, for all of us to put Burleigh Marx into a larger context within the art of the garden, within the visual arts of his time, and within the larger context, the larger panorama of conservation and ecological activism, themes that have such importance and deep relevance for our own times. And then at the end of the talks, I will ask all of the participants to come and sit here. We will have questions, dialogue amongst ourselves, and then questions from the audience before ending at 12:30. So I thought the most efficient thing to do would be to introduce the three speakers right now before I give a little bit more of a talk, and I should put on the title of it so that you know what it is. So let me do that. Let me present to you the three speakers, and then they will give their talks one after the other. So Raymond Jungles, many of you know, I'm sure all of you know, an extraordinary person. The first time I went to his studio, his house, his gardens in Miami, I was virtually overwhelmed, and he is the heart and soul of the plant persona of this exhibition. He has done an amazing, amazing garden. Some of you have seen it, and if you haven't, you will, I hope, do so after the symposium. He is the founder of the Miami-based landscape architectural firm, Raymond Jungles Incorporated, and of course is recognized for his implementation of private and public gardens in Miami, in the Caribbean, and elsewhere. And I think always channeling the Burleigh Marx inspiration, because he knew Burleigh Marx from the early 1980s and would regularly go every year down to Rio and work with Roberto Burle Marx. And also when Roberto came to the United States, he would be very important to his whereabouts, to Roberto's whereabouts in this country. So he's done not only gardens in Florida, but in elsewhere, as I mentioned earlier, and he will speak to us about the legacy of Burleigh Marx in the United States. Catherine Sievert-Nordenson is Associate Professor of Landscape Architecture at the City College of New York, and her research and designs include design adaptation to sea level rise and urban coastal environments, as well as novel landscape restoration practices given the dynamics of climate change. She is the author of what I think is one of the most brilliant contributions to the large literature on Roberto Burle Marx, a book that was published by University of Texas Press only last year called Depositions, and it looks at Burle Marx and politics, a very, very interesting, complex story of his relationship to the political spectrum in Brazil from the 1930s when he began his career as a garden architect up until his death in 1994, and she will discuss that subject. And Isabella Ono is the daughter of the business partner of Roberto Burle Marx and Hariyosho Ono, who died only very recently, and Isabella and her brother Giulio are now directors of the Burle Marx studio, and is also very influential in the newly formed foundation of Roberto Burle Marx. She joined the Burle Marx studio as a landscape architect and oversees the implementation and maintenance of the gardens and general management of the company. And as a matter of fact, I think many of us do not realize, or many of you do not realize, I do, but some people don't, that Burle Marx project or Burle Marx studio continues to this day. So if you are desirous of having a Burle Marx garden for your backyard, Isabella is the person to contact. So, all right. So, as a professor at NYU, particularly of Latin American art, I've had a long-standing interest in Brazil and Brazilian art, and I've worked on many projects in Brazil and in the United States relating to Brazilian art since the 1980s and 1990s. And so therefore, when I was asked to do the curating of this exhibition, I was just completely thrilled. I had first become aware of Roberto Burle Marx in my my first trip to Brazil in the mid-1980s and visiting Rio particularly and the gardens there and his huge landscape of Flamengo Gardens, which is right in front of the Avenida Atlântica, which is the signature place. I'll show you a photograph after these two wonderful pictures of Roberto Burle Marx, which I think set up the idea of him as a gregarious person, as a person who's so involved in so many things, plant life and making paintings and drawings and painting on tablecloths and painting on all sorts of surfaces, and here he is, a living work of art, covered with paint that he has just been using in one of his pictures that you will probably see upstairs. Another stimulus for this exhibition was the spectacular show done in 2016 at the Jewish Museum here in New York. That was a brilliant exhibition, and I think I was so nurtured by it, as I had also been in 1993 when MoMA, when the Museum of Modern Art presented another wonderful show of Burle Marx, which I don't want to say introduced him to American audiences, because he had been traveling to the United States since the mid-1940s. He was a very regular fixture in the American landscape, as it were, going to conferences, speaking to friends and colleagues, designing gardens for the U.S., very few of which were realized. His house for Mr. and Mrs. Burton Tremaine in the 1940s, his garden for the house that was being designed for them was not realized, although at Longwood Gardens near Philadelphia, he did do an important section of that public garden, so there is at least one major project here in the U.S. So he was a fixture in people's minds, but I think that he is renowned in Brazil. He is certainly a household word in Brazil, and the creator of one of the most classic or signature tourist views of the most Brazilian cities, if I can say that, Rio de Janeiro. That is, of course, the walkway along the Atlantic Avenue, or Avenida Atlântica, which is done, we can see here, in Pedra Portuguesa. Pedra Portuguesa is Portuguese stone, this black and white stone, that is not actually an invention of Burle Marx, because if you go to Portugal and you go to other places in Brazil that were done in the walkways like this done in the 19th century, such as in Manaus or such as in various parts of Portugal, you will see these circuitous patterns that had been used, but Burle Marx really elevated this to its extraordinary height. But for as famous as he is, he's not necessarily a household word all the time in the United States. So our exhibition is meant to provoke interest and further research into his work. More than anything, this exhibition is meant to cause its audiences to reflect on the importance of the environment and the singularity of the effects of nature on the human spirit and the human condition. Roberto Burle Marx was, perhaps above all other things, a conservationist, an ecologist, and a crusader for the health of the planet. This is what makes this exhibition so significant at this moment of planetary crisis in a time of rapidly unraveling climate change. In one of the essays that I wrote for the book that accompanies the show, I call Burle Marx a total work of art. Now you can, as Carrie just said, think of this as a sort of really totally man type of work, but I actually had something else in mind, which was the idea of total work of art, or in German, the language that Burle Marx's father spoke. He was an emigre into Brazil from Germany. The word Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art, is often referred to as a Wagnerian term. Richard Wagner, much admired by Burle Marx, as a matter of fact, created what he called Gesamtkunstwerken, total works of art, in operas, in which the idea of the story, the music, the stage setting, the smoke, the atmosphere, everything works together, as in his most monumental total work of art, the Ring cycle of operas, the Ring of the Nibelungen. So I think that that idea of Burleigh Marx doing things together, he just didn't create gardens, he created everything. He was this spectacular Renaissance individual. And even in this particular slide, in a 1956 photograph of the garden for the Pignatari family in Sao Paulo, where he did much work, although his affinities, his heart was in Rio, although he was born in Sao Paulo, and as a matter of fact. This garden, which is now the garden of a very fancy, very beautiful hotel in Sao Paulo called Palacio Tangará, which is situated in this huge Roberto Burle Marx park in Sao Paulo. It's one of the lungs of that city, along with Ibirapuera Park, where all of Oscar Niemeyer's great Biennale buildings are, and Niemeyer and Burle Marx in many cases worked together in synergistic accord, although they weren't always the best of friends, but they were wonderful partners. But I just chose to show this as one of the few slides I want to show you today as an idea that Burle Marx would design sculpture. He would do this sculptural wall, and we have a beautiful re-evocation of a sculptural wall by Burle Marx in the Raymond Jungles designed garden that you will see. But he also takes care to create grasses of this checkerboard pattern mixed with the colors of the trees and the plantings that he created, and they function together with the climactic experience that you have with realizing the colors and the change of seasons, although in Brazil this is very subtle, but the breezes of different times of the day. He was aware of all of this, and he wanted all of us to be aware of this as we are walking through these gardens. In another photograph that is very evocative of particularly his use of color, this is a 1954 project, a garden for a private residence in Petrpolis, that was the house of which was designed by Oscar Niemeyer. I spoke a moment ago about Niemeyer's affinities for Burle Marx. But I'm so struck by his use of color, and if you go to the Sítio Burle Marx, his estate near Rio, in a section of the state of Rio de Janeiro called Barra de Guaraciba, where he started buying parcels of land in the 1940s, and by 1985, when Burle Marx gave it to the state of Brazil as a public monument, it was a huge and extraordinary venue for all the plants that he would find in his excursions throughout Brazil, his expeditions to find and to preserve plants that were in danger of extinction. So here he is using color as a major part of the whole concept of this total work of art. And I think that color in the conception of Burle Marx is obviously related to his paintings that I'll show you in just a moment, but also to his immense interest in different types of arts. In the Sítio, which comprises his house, his studios, there are two of them, and other outbuildings, including a 17th century church, a Baroque chapel on the grounds of the Sítio that he restored, so that again is part of this total work of art. The idea of color in the folk art collection, for example, that he had. He was a great lover of collecting, and collecting is an art in itself. And he was particularly, I think, struck by the colors and the shapes and the forms that he saw in folk art, and particularly in Brazilian popular arts, of which there are hundreds and hundreds examples in his collection. So what you will see on the 6th floor in this building is a very discrete type of representation of his paintings, drawings, tapestry, and prints. When conceiving of this, I was interested in doing a show that was very different from the grand panoramic show that was at the Jewish Museum several years ago. And I thought the last 30 years of Burle Marx's life, 64 to 94, would be a very good lens through which to look at that phase of his art. In 1964, there was the military coup in Brazil. In 1967, he received and accepted an invitation from the military government to cooperate as a member of the Federal Cultural Council. He accepted this specifically as a public platform to advance his conservation and his conservation activism, as he did, as Catherine Sievert will explain in just a few moments, through a series of writings, of speeches, etc. And also, at this time, in the 60s, his art in paintings, tapestries, drawings, and prints veers into a realm of almost complete abstraction, very often combining pure geometric abstraction with a gestural type of abstraction. One of the most interesting things about Burle Marx, and something that I think many people don't realize, is that he was deeply involved with this boom of radical art that happens in Brazil, particularly in Rio and Sao Paulo, beginning in the late 1940s and going through the 50s, 60s, and 70s. We know, for example, artists like Lygia Pape or Lygia Clark or Elio Orticica are names that of artists who have been shown very much in the recent past in New York and London and elsewhere, and of course in Brazil. And Burle Marx was very much involved in this type of radical art. And he was the teacher of Lygia Clark, as a matter of fact. He had an open studio in his atelier in the Leme district of Rio, and there he received young artists for many years and would work with them. They would show him their work, they would discuss it, and Lygia Clark was one of those artists. So I wanted to look at the art from this period, from the 60s to the 90s, and he was very active almost up to the year of his death, 1994. And this type of art that you see that integrates the type of colors that he was thinking about in his art of the garden into a two-dimensional form is something that again speaks to us of this highly synergistic, of this highly interpenetrative form of art in which he will do gardens, he will do paintings, he will do prints, he will do jewelry design. And jewelry design was an extremely important aspect of his work. His brother Haroldo, he comes from an extraordinary family. Haroldo, Burle Marx, and Roberto would do jewelry designs together. And then Roberto would also work with his brother Walter, who was a renowned musician, the creator of the Rio Symphony, conductor of the Philadelphia Orchestra. And so this whole thing, I end by saying this, by reverting back to this idea of the totality of the arts in his imagination, that it is color, it is form, it is light, space, air, breeze, and substance that are occupying his imagination. And I would ask you, when you go to the gardens, keep in mind what you see in the galleries upstairs. And I think it will give you a very good idea of a person who is constantly thinking about nature, constantly thinking about its preservation, and constantly producing virtually up until the moment of his death. So we will now hear from the three speakers, and I'm very, very pleased to ask Raymond Jungles to come up to the podium. Thank you very much. Okay, that's perfect.
Thank you all for being here. I'm very honored to be here to talk about Roberto Burle Marx, who was a hero of mine. I was asked to talk a little bit about his influence on landscape architecture in the United States through my eyes. I've met many people who've, over the years, architects and landscape architects and interior designers who talk about how much he's influenced them. From 1982 to 1994, I was able to have the honor to go down to Rio and to spend time at the sitio as a guest of Roberto Burle Marx. And although I never worked with Roberto, I was part of his entourage, which meant I didn't have to work, I just got to have a lot of fun all the time. And I ended up helping him sell his art in the United States, in the Miami area, and I would get a commission, and I would take the commission, I would just buy more of his art. So this piece you see behind me is in the show here, is one of the pieces that I'm missing solely right now because it's no longer in its space in my house. But I'm so happy to be part of continuing the legacy of someone who's done so much for me in my life. And the beautiful drawings that he did in black and white were phenomenal. The first drawing I ever bought from Roberto, he used to work actually on my drawing board in my house, and he would take works like these papers. Actually, he was traveling when I first met him with these black and white ink sketches, and not so much the painted fabrics. And he would actually work on them in my house. One time he spilled some ink on my drawing board, and I didn't want to clean it up because it reminded me of him, and it was a great honor to have that there. But the first piece I ever bought was one from him then. I paid $500 for it. I think I had about $600 at the time. And you can see just Roberto on the upper right-hand side, we had this one in our house, and Roberto one time he walked by it and he did something like this. So he definitely had figurative things in his mind when he was doing these paintings. And I saw him paint in all different styles. The one on the lower right-hand side is a painting that was in the Venice Biennale, and it was just one of the strongest pieces. That's the one that's right in front of my drawing board in my home studio. And tile work he would do. This is actually on a rooftop in Rio de Janeiro, and that's the famous Corcovado off in the distance. I purchased a piece like this from him that's now in the Naples Botanical Gardens, and I'm so happy to have his art in a public place where everybody can enjoy it. We actually had it here in a vertical position in the 2009 Orchid Show. And he was a sculptor. On the upper right-hand side was a sculpture that we actually built for the '93 show at MoMA. It was a crazy day for me because I'd been out with an architect and his wife the night before, and we had too much wine. And I was on a ladder all day in this room where no one was in there. I was all by myself, but the results were wonderful. And it led to me meeting some very interesting people. And the sculptural wall you see on the lower right, I saw that actually getting built. Roberto had a Brazilian-Italian friend, a sculptor, and I went to the studio, and it was all on the floor, all at different levels. It was all done in segments and then reconstructed inside the Banco Safra building. And this is what inspired me, and they did such a great job building that here so it could be disassembled and moved to other locations. Great landscape architect. Obviously, the pattern you see on the left is actually it's a historic Portuguese pattern, but what you see on the right is pure Burleigh Marx. So he took his imagination and he created a work of art that unifies all of Copacabana with all different styles of architecture. And as you walk down the sidewalk, it actually massages you. It's an amazing thing. And I got to see certain gardens that he did, like Garden Vargem Grande. I got to see it before it was started and got to see it completed. And the time I was there, and it was just wonderful to be there with Roberto's client, Clemente Gomez, and his family. And that was one of the great things. I actually was able to meet his clients, meet his business associates. I knew Isabella when she was just a little girl. And every trip to Brazil was just a marvelous inspiration, and his work has inspired me to this day. On the left, you see he was collecting fragments of colonial buildings that were destroyed in Rio, and he did his own composition. This is at the Sitio, so he surrounded himself with art, with people he liked, with great food, an occasional whiskey, and it was an amazing experience. If you haven't been there, it's open to the public. You just have to make a reservation. It's Sitio Roberto Burle Marx, and I tell you, you should all go see it because I think it's the world's greatest garden. And it's a little sad for me because he's not there anymore, but I think you'll feel his spirit, as Carrie so wonderfully said yesterday. Every year he'd build a new sculpture. He'd have a big party for his friends on August 4th, which was his birthday. And there'd be a different sculpture to celebrate that year. When I first started going there was this facade from a building in Rio that he'd saved, but no atelier behind it. He built this art studio for visiting artists to come work there, and so that he could work at a much larger scale. Unfortunately, it was completed just before 1994 when he left us. And when I first went there was this beautiful rock, and he said, "Raymond, come see this rock." And we went over there, and he says, "I'm going to do a water garden here, and then the rock will be magnified." because water has that magical quality of bringing in the universe and making everything seem larger and taking a garden to another dimension. And I have to say that they're doing a wonderful job keeping the garden as Roberto would have had it. In fact, they maintain it more now than they did then. It's the water feature that floods the roof on a summer kitchen. I never saw that in all the time I was there. They restored that so the water floods the roof and then drops down into the water garden below. And he'd do these incredible sculptures of stones from a region. He was always working with materials from the region. And they built this sculpture, and then we actually went on horses, and with Haru and with a bunch of the people who worked for him, and we went up and we collected bromeliads and agaves up in the mountains, and then that's how we festooned this sculpture with that, and that was how he was creating his garden there. Amazing. Imagine I was 25 seeing work like this bold and so beautiful. Not only this, but meeting the Brazilian people and seeing the Brazilian landscape, which is very powerful. And I've often said that the reason Roberto's gardens were so powerful and so strong was you can't do a wimpy garden in front of a landscape like that. And every year after his birthday, he would take a group of people on plant collecting excursions to distant regions. This is in Minas Gerais, and even though he wasn't climbing like he used to, and there's a beautiful photo of him hanging off a Jeep on one of his excursions here, he had his binoculars and he would direct. And one of the things I like to do was, I like to be the driver on these excursions. Even though you're on dirt roads, a lot of time you ended up eating a lot of dirt, but because I got to sit next to Roberto and I have more conversation with him. So that's how you got to get more conversation with Roberto, was to be the driver. And they called me the goat because, being cramped in these vehicles for so long, every time we stopped, I would get out and I'd rock climb and I'd try to get as much exercise as I could. And often I'd find a plant that no one else saw because I was up in the hills. One time I was finishing a particular good book when I got to a new site. The area had already been devastated pretty well, but we were collecting epiphytes and philodendrons and aeroids. And I was reading the last 2 pages. And Roberto comes over to me and he says, "Raymond, here we read nature." So I never took a book again. So he was a great man. He was a great friend, very generous, very funny. He filled the room. His client loved him. That's Roberto on the left. That's me when I had hair in the center. And this is my son, Benjamin, who actually I gave the middle name Burleigh. And was Roberto influential? This book on the lower right-hand side, The Tropical Gardens of Roberto Burle Marx, really changed my life. I have to say, I heard about Roberto at the University of Florida in Newton's book, Design on the Land. And I got to borrow this book from a friend who was already in the landscape architecture program. I was in architectural design still at the time. And then I knew after seeing what this man had done in his life, that's exactly what I wanted to do. And there's more books. Isabella just gave me one today, so 25 books on one man. There must be at least 30, but that's a pretty remarkable body of work. So just showing a few of my projects. I know that I'm probably already more than halfway through my time, but I would hope that you could see some of his influence. This is a Susan Jones garden down in Key West. And I obviously was influenced by Barragan as well. I think I'm more South American than North American in many ways. By the way, I want to say, I'm so happy to say that my wife of 10 years, Gina, and I are having our anniversary today. And she's Brazilian. But we use a lot of native plants, just like Roberto always preached. He and I think that's one of the reasons we became friends, because I came from a very strong appreciation of nature and ecology. Before I even got into landscape architecture, I was always a student of nature. And I think the best landscape architects are. And I think that the landscape architects, we've always been stewards of the land. And that Design with Nature is a book that we had, Ian McHarg's book in school, and it's always been my approach to landscape architecture. And this job we did with Herzog and Demeron in Miami Beach is all native plants from the Everglades. And so, interesting story about this job was Carl Fisher had promoted Lincoln Road by having elephants come and rip mangroves, actually rip mangroves out of the beginning of Lincoln Road. So my whole idea was to put mangroves back where they were before. So we sort of practice this sort of subversive garden design where we bring plants that are no longer in the urban environment back in the urban environment, so their seeds are there, so the birds will eat them, so that they'll spread throughout the community. But, you know, for the longest time, I never really worked in an office. I started my own office primarily so I could go to Brazil when I could every year. And so the beautiful thing was that I didn't learn anything bad in an office, but I learned everything that I know by making a lot of mistakes. And I knew I wouldn't. I started doing residential projects, and I knew I wouldn't really be able to do projects like this, where I impact a lot of the public space where people can really enjoy it, till later in my career. And I'm so happy now that we're doing these sort of civic projects. This project is about 8 years old in the ground, so we moved very large trees in there. We didn't plant as many trees as the regulations say, 1 tree every 20 feet on center, because it didn't make any sense. A lot of regulations don't. It's on the north side of a very tall building. The trees in the middle of that block that I saw originally, this was open to automobile traffic. Working with the great developer Robert Burle, we were able to convince the city to put it back into, although it's no longer Morris Lapidus block, it has a spirit of Morris Lapidus and is open to the public as a pedestrian mall now. And this project I call the Bat Cave. It's actually on the top of the garage that Herzog and Demeron did. And I think you can feel the power of nature in this garden. Soil is very shallow, mostly 8 inches deep, and some areas mounted up to 2.5 feet deep. A mixture, it's not all native plants, but a good majority of it is. On a rooftop garden, agaves, bromeliads, and vines are a good way to get a lot of massive green. And Miami Beach Botanical Garden, it's really not a botanical garden. We love doing botanical garden work, but it's like a great little urban park. They had all the native Florida plants back in the northwest corner, and I kind of freed them and moved them through the whole garden, and we reworked the whole circulation and added water features, and it's really a very popular place for events now in Miami Beach. And one of my favorites, the Brazilian garden in Naples Botanical Gardens. All the plants, this one was one of my more difficult projects because they're all Brazilian plants, with the exception of the aquatic plants, because some of them are invasive in the United States, so we didn't use any water plants. But Naples Botanical Garden is a great place because a lot of it was a melaleuca and Australian pine. They tore it all out. They created, I think, 2/3 of the whole property as a nature conservation area. And this is the Burleigh Marx Plaza. A lot of people get married here, and for me it was such a, I guess I'm always channeling Roberto, but especially in botanical garden work. So just like here, working with Todd Forrest and his group, water is a major theme, but we actually did a water garden that's temporary for only a few months, which is a pretty remarkable thing. I've never really had that sort of opportunity. I prefer doing permanent gardens. It can be there and a lot of people can see, but this is an amazing, amazing opportunity, and I think a lot of people are going to enjoy it and really learn more about my friend Roberto. Grove at Grand Bay, another project we just finished with Bjarke Jungles. We find ourselves working now on some of these multifamily projects, but we're only going to work on them if landscape can be a very contributing factor and there's an equal collaboration where the landscape is as important as the architecture. Now that's tough in some cases when you have architecture as dramatic as the Twisting Towers Bjarke did. But it was a great collaboration. We used all the indigenous stone from Florida, the oolitic limestone on all the walls on the building podium, working with Bjarke. And of course, the water garden is essential. Most of that garden is actually on a building, on top of a parking garage. As you get in these urban areas, land becomes much more valuable, and landscape ends up being built on structure. So, as you know, in the Hudson Yards, that's another thing. But we don't really air condition below the garden there because we don't have all the mechanical stuff that they had. That would be a tough situation. But there's about an 8-foot grade change from one tower to the other, a lot of ramps, sidewalks. The whole thing that we try to do is create as many experiences for the garden user as possible to entice people to get out and move through the garden. And that's something I think Roberto Burle Marx's gardens did so well. Another project with Herzog and Demeron, the ocean's actually off to the right. I need to get them to Photoshop that in. But we created, they built a tower, 70 stories, and put 4 stories of parking garage below grade so that rather than a typical situation where there's a podium that the tower sits on and no garden, the garden actually rolls right up over the parking garage. And we've actually sunk areas in the parking garage to be able to plant larger trees. And created a beach entry pool. There's also a lap pool on this property. We just finished that, so we don't have very many good photos right now. And this one we just finished in Panama, and I'm able to do these projects now where there's great topography in the Caribbean and Central America, and I start to have these like amazing backdrops of landscape that Roberto had. So some of these gardens end up looking a little more Burle Marx. Now, we dug the lake because the site was all terrace platforms. It was a chicken farm. There was nothing but coops there. And I needed the fill to be able to recreate undulating landscape landforms that look more natural. Always water, always the sound of water. It rains a lot there. They actually have more runoff from precipitation here, so they don't really need to use the well to fill this lake ever. And then, of course, I'm very passionate about using native plants. And this is one working with Ethan Freed, Dr. Ethan Freed, and the Bahamas National Trust, and the Leon Levy Foundation. We did a garden that is now the TripAdvisor #1 destination in Eleuthera, using all native plants. This is the water garden where we highlight aquatic Bahamian plants. And it was just a rectangular cistern at one time when we started. And once again, it's the beginning. You come through it on a trail and you work through the space. We took invasive Australian pines and made them into tree perches. And the children and the people really love this place. You really feel nature when you're there. Find a House with Foster Partners is a condo project, another multifamily project we did on the beach in Miami Beach. We did the whole FINA district, working with OMA and the Arts District and the historic FINA Hotel. Most of this is also on structure, but the whole idea was using water and native plants built on structure to create a garden that evoked the natural dune plants that you'd find there, which is a smart thing to do because it's tough to grow finicky plants in an environment where you get so much salt spray and so much wind, and it can really desiccate plants. We did four blocks of beach walk with trees on both sides for shade, and it's one of my favorite projects. And one more project I want to show you before I leave is Golden Rock Inn that we did with Bryce and Helen Martin in Nevis, where we were able to work with people who love plants as much as I do and love art as much as I do, probably more, and create an amazing garden that does very well in the climate of Nevis. It's about 1,000 feet above sea level, so there's a lot of precipitation for at least 7 months of the year, and everything was irrigated just temporarily to get it going, and then It has to make it on its own, and if something's struggling, it can get a little bit of additional water, but there's no irrigation running at all here. And then the garden that we were able to do here at the New York Botanical Gardens, as I said before, we started working on this over 3 years ago when Gregory Long and Todd Forrest brought me up here to talk about this possibility. And I was extremely intrigued. I said, I'll do it for free. They said, no, no. Gregory said, this has to be a real project, Raymond. I wanted to get your real attention. So that's kind of how it all started. Some of my ideas were a little bit outlandish, like I didn't really want to have a separate ADA walk, so I was going to actually ramp the whole lawn, and Todd says, Raymond, you know how many trucks that's going to take to do that? So there's been some compromise, but I think the garden actually got better as it went along. And then what talk wouldn't be complete without a sunrise over Rio de Janeiro? One of the first trips I took down there when I was at the Hotel Sheraton, I took this photo. So thank you all very much.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for this invitation to participate in the exhibition, the consultation, the questions, to write an essay for the catalog for this great exhibition and installation of the garden. I love that last photograph of the sunset, or the sunrise, which reminds me of when I was living in Rio, and I was impressed that on the beaches in the evening when the sun set over the ocean, everyone applauded. And I guess that was really kind of the beauty of that city. So today I'm going to talk about some of Roberto Burle Marx's work as an advocate for conservation of the environment. Of course, we know this is that beautiful rock in the sitio that Raymond referred to. This is 1970s, and there's Roberto in his garden. And we know he was a very fun guy, right? So I think that it's really interesting for me to really unpack this other aspect of Roberto, which was as both a plant conservationist, but also an observer of what was happening in his native Brazil, the destruction of the environment under a series of repressive governments. And his role dressed up here in tie and suit at a table looking very official, as an advocate for the environment. And it's really the nascent moment of the environmental movement in Brazil in the late 1960s. He was invited, as Edward mentioned, to be a cultural counselor to the state, to the new military regime in 1967, a role which he played for 7 years until 1974. And during that period, during that 7-year period, he gave 18 depositions, each of which really vehemently promoted a position toward the protection of the environment, of the greater realm of what is natural, what is nature in Brazil, and how that was actually a cultural aspect of the country, and it was the duty of the state to protect that culture. He was very on point and extremely articulate in these depositions. But when thinking about this exhibition last summer, Edward and I spoke, I thought it would be very interesting to think about what happened after that 7-year period. And there was one deposition, in this case to the Brazilian Senate, not as a member of the Federal Cultural Council, that Burle Marx came back to the political arena in 1976 to give a very powerful testament to the Brazilian Senate in Brasilia about the role of the Amazon forest and its relationship to the Brazilian state. So I started thinking about that in that one piece that I hadn't yet fully translated, and I wanted to really unpack that and think about, well, what is the Amazon, and who does the Amazon belong to? And I think this is really quite interesting. At this time, there's quite an interesting legal battle with the Internet Corporation of Assigned Names and Numbers, and this is actually between Amazon and Amazon. So I think there's a very interesting New York City component to this. We just had our own battle with Amazon in Queens, and so as I was Googling around for research on my essay, I kept hitting Amazon in Queens, and so there's this interesting protracted battle going on right now, which is still in a public comment 30-day waiting period between this Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers and Amazon Corporation. And the legal battle is between the 9 countries which fringe the Amazon, or that actually have parts of the Amazon basin within their state, and Amazon.com. So Amazon.com would like to own the domain .amazon, whereas these 9 countries are saying, no, that's a geopolitical and geographical domain, and that should be ours. You shouldn't have that. So it's very interesting to see probably the greatest carbon emission corporation in the world pitted against the greatest carbon sink in the world. And so these 2 entities are battling it out. It looks like Amazon.com will win .amazon, but it is open for public comment, and so if the New York Botanical Garden would perhaps comment on this, I think that might be a strong voice of advocacy for this decision. So here's the physical map of Brazil, and I think it's also really fascinating to see how important riverine systems are in this great floodplain. And the Amazon basin itself is shown there. There's also a state, it's very confusing, there's a state called Amazonas, which has the capital of Manaus with the famous opera house and the black and white paving, which is well known. There's also something that's called Amazonia Legal, which means legal Amazonia, defined in 1948 by the state of Brazil, and it includes all of the northern states plus Mato Grosso and part of Maranhão, and this is considered a legal entity into which social and economic development would be occurring as that nation continued to build. So that's these states of Brazil. But this idea that the Amazon was something big and needing this definition has a very long history. And of course, any country that's essentially colonized by the coast often face this problem of how to bring populations to the interior. So what we see here is this propaganda poster with President Getúlio Vargas from 1938 saying, "O verdadeiro sentido de brasilidade é a marcha para o oeste," which means the true meaning of Brazilianness is to move to the west. And so this was very much an operation. You can see the rail and the migration westward, this idea that there was a big, vast, unsettled territory at risk because it had not yet been claimed by the state through essentially colonization. And this kind of politicization of the Amazon continues in the military regime in the 1960s. So this becomes a sort of military operation, Operation Amazonia, as you see on this cover from the agency that is going to develop the Amazon. It starts to become the mission of the state, in fact, to bring people to this otherwise empty place, settle it, make it profitable, and actually part of that would be to develop as a place of agricultural production, but also other types of commerce and resource extraction. And the military regime in the late 1960s, so around the time, this is actually the very year that Burleigh Marx is asked by President Castelo Branco to join the Federal Council of Culture. That same year, Castelo Branco also initiates the Operation Amazon, and this is one of those early images from the early 70s of the road of the Trans-Amazonian Highway being cut through the Amazon forest. Again, another image of that construction. That would continue through successive generals of the dictatorship through Ernesto Geisel. Here, photographed from an open military helicopter observing the progress on the road over the Amazon. So again, this idea that this was a big, vast, vazia demográfica, an empty demographic zone that needed to be controlled and inhabited, really, with these colonies and made productive to be part of this new and modern conception of Brazil. So I thought it'd be helpful to kind of look back and think about how did this come to be? How was the Amazon understood historically? And in fact, the first explorer who goes down the Amazon, actually floating down the Amazon River from Quito, so from the west to the east, is a Spaniard. His name is Francisco de Orellano. He's the first Westerner to actually navigate the entire length of the fluvial passage of the Amazon River. But he was Spaniard, so he actually came around from the other side of the Andes, from Quito, mounted the Andes, and then floated down to the mouth of the river. But by the 1700s, the Queen of Portugal actually started to take quite an interest in her colony of Brazil. So Queen Maria I sent Alexandre Rodrigues Ferreira, who was actually born in Brazil, in the colony, educated in Portugal, and then sent back to explore the Amazon. His report, or his final kind of publication, was Viagem Filosófica, a philosophical voyage. And it's the life and work of this great, and he's now, even actually during the military regime, brought to this new level of the Brasiliana publication, a series of books, and exemplified as the first Brazilian explorer of the Amazon. So claiming back that role from Orellana, the Spaniard. This was his path up the Amazon River and its tributaries, this period from 1783 to 1792, so just earlier than Humboldt's travels, actually, in the northern side of the Amazon. His book was filled with incredible images, two-headed turtles, dead crocodiles. So these amazing images of the flora, the fauna, and also the people, the indigenous, the first representations of the indigenous peoples of the Amazonian territory were brought to the Western view for the first time. Much later, we have another European, actually this is an Austrian gentleman, Carl Friedrich Philipp von Martius, who actually accompanies the wedding party of the marriage of a Portuguese and Austrian nobility to the wedding ceremony in Rio. And part of this is to continue on a scientific journey with his colleague, Martius, who is, Martius's colleague is a zoologist, Spitz, and the two of them actually take another incredible journey, producing this incredible map of Brazil divided into phytogeographic regions. It's the first time that this term has been applied to such a grand scale. They're arguing that geography, plant life, and habitat all work together as a kind of symbiotic relationship, and that they should not be read as isolated types. This is their journey at the end of the 19th century. This collection actually produces an incredible book called Flora Brasiliensis. It's here in the Mertz Library. It's not just a flora, however. Because Martius was so fascinated by this idea of the phytogeographic regions, he produced also these amazing drawings of the different regions of Brazil, in this case the Serra de Orgos, which is just outside of Rio de Janeiro, the Caatinga forest, or the white-trunked trees, is very dry interior landscape, and of course the Amazon basin drawings. And Burleigh Marx often comments about these drawings of Martius and his ability to create these phytogeographic regions. And I think a lot of his work with plant associations, his position that certain plants worked well together, not just aesthetically but ecologically, I think is drawn from this study of Martius. Here's a drawing by Burleigh Marx, and there's two very similar ones upstairs in the exhibition, where he's actually drawing the Amazon basin, and you can see a lot of relationships between the density of these etchings by Martius and Burleigh Marx's own work. I wanted to just bring this image to attention, however. It's also from the Phytogeographic Views, and this is cited by Burleigh Marx in this Senate deposition of 1976. He mentions this view of Martius of the interior of the country, where the fire is used to destroy the existing vegetation in order to clear the land for agricultural use. And this is a technique called coivara. The technique is used by indigenous peoples as well as colonizers, but this is a view that Martius captures. It's the only nighttime view that he makes in this series of etchings, where you see a fire and the fleeing animals in the center of Brazil, in the state of Minas Gerais. So these are very interesting early explorers. There's another movement that happens right after the emperor of Brazil is deposed, and there's a new, this is 1889, there's a new movement to redefine the state as a new kind of independent modern place. And a commission is formed, which is a joint commission of the Ministry of War and the Ministry of Agriculture, Industry, and Commerce. So this kind of strange meeting of agriculture and war that want to actually penetrate the Amazon again and determine its extent. So you can imagine the War Ministry is interested in protecting the borders. Ministry of Agriculture and Commerce is very much interested in exploiting that territory for profit. So the expedition is led by this very interesting general, Candido Marino da Silva Rondon. It's called the Comissão Rondon. It is a 9-year period from a multi-expedition. There are 2 routes, but it essentially endures from 1907 until 1916. Rondon actually writes an incredible series of books of his expedition, which is ostensibly to create a connection between this hinterland and the coast, which is settled, and the hinterland's very empty. So his mission is actually to lay a telegraph line. So although it's kind of on the surface about communications and connections, for Rondon, it's also a very interesting anthropological study. He's very interested in the native peoples of the region and is in fact the founder of the Indian Institute of Brazil. But here are a few images. He brought along a filmmaker, a glass plate photographer, and a botanist. So there's a very interesting pseudo-scientific expedition which has this kind of overlying mission of laying of the telegraph. So you can see what's happening here, not unlike that carving of the Trans-Amazonian Highway, the cutting of the trees through the Amazon in order to create a surface on which you can lay the telegraph line. And again, the labor implications of this, as you can imagine, are extreme. Everyone's getting malaria and yellow fever and snake bites. So there's an incredible toll on the workforce here. But it results in the construction and the connection of the hinterland to the coast through these series of telegraph stations along the way. And of course, there are the meetings of the commission with the native tribes, the Xingu tribe, and actually the gentleman, Rondon, is in the middle, looking to his right, and next to him is the expedition's botanist, Carlo Hoeni, who becomes a very important botanist and historian of basically the next edition of the Flora Brasiliensis book. So he brings it to the next level in the 20th century. Of course, the Amazon is also has actually 2 waves of rubber booms, one before the First World War and the other one during the Second World War. So there are 2 massive movements to penetrate the forest in order to access the rubber latex from the rubber tree, which grows as an independent tree amidst many others, mostly a survival technique because it is actually very vulnerable to a certain fungus that travels through the canopy. So they actually do best when they're far apart from each other. So of course, collecting rubber, as you can see in this photograph on the right, from the early 20th century, is a very painstaking and labor involved process. During World War II, with an agreement between Vargas and the United States, more of these rubber soldiers were sent into the Amazon to extract rubber latex and vulcanize that latex as part of a war effort within the Amazon. Of course, Henry Ford, even earlier, 1926 through 45, is pushing the idea of a rubber tree plantation in Brazil. So again, this complicity with the presidents of the country, and now we're starting to see international influences on the resources of the Amazon, and access to those resources is starting to play out very early on. Fordlandia, which is not too far from, you see here in this detail map, Manaus and Santarém. It's very close to Santarém. Essentially, some portions of land are bought, and Ford has this idea to grow a rubber tree plantation, which ultimately fails for several reasons. The most important of which that the disease spreading through the canopies, which are the connection of the trees within plantation, the rubber tree does not do well in that situation. So that despite the fact that an entire factory town is built on this bank of the Rio, of the Amazon's tributary, and the housing for the workers, this initiative completely fails. Later, we start to see more of these multinational and international delves into the Amazon during the military dictatorship, during this Operação Amazonica. The most fascinating one, perhaps, Daniel Ludwig, an American, initiates something called the Jari Project, another plantation, forest tree plantation initiative, but this time for paper pulp, is also an Amazonian endeavor that is, again, incentivized by the military government from 1967 to 81. This is some of the kind of contemporary reporting on the project. It starts to become a little, it's actually very extreme. There's a factory which is produced, a floating factory produced in Japan and floated all the way around the Cape of Horn into Brazil, in order to, this is the floating factory diagram, to process the pulp. So it's actually a kind of in and out mobile factory. You can see it here in ruins. Again, another failed attempt at creating a plantation of forest within the Amazon. It's interesting in that the soils of the Amazon are actually not particularly rich. The reason it's so biodiverse and green is that, in fact, it's all of the foliage and the nutrients from the leaves of the trees that are growing there in density and many, many layers that produces the wealth of nutrients. However, once you deforest, you strip that level of nutrification and produce a very sterile soil. So these initiatives that would constantly fail. So this idea that you could somehow colonize the Amazon started to prove rather untenable. Again, we see a very interesting drawing from Roberto Burle Marx, an undated drawing, an etching actually from probably the late 1960s. And you can see inscribed on the right, Fora Ludwig, Jari, Merda, Guerra. So he wants this guy out. So there's suddenly a shift in the Brazilian psyche. Why is our government bringing in other corporations to our Amazon? And his position with the speech he gives to the Senate is to really recalibrate that relationship between what he sees as the Brazilian heritage, this incredible forest, which is really the defining presence in the country, and these other forces that are starting to exploit it. As I mentioned, he essentially had been serving in this kind of consular role for quite some time. This is his installation in 1967, his meetings at the Federal Council of Culture in Rio. All of these speeches are published in the proceedings of that panel in this journal called Cultura. His first one was called The Brazilian Landscape. This is the very first position piece he gives in 1967, where he makes this argument that, in fact, the Brazilian landscape is part and parcel of the Brazilian culture and should be protected as such. And again, his 30 years of experience as a landscape architect, as a person who has been traveling around the country, documenting and observing the devastation which is occurring in the interior and at the coasts, is invaluable. There's a very interesting position piece called Forest Politics and the Destruction of Forests. Here, interestingly, he does not refer to the Amazon except as a kind of tabular count. He's really very much interested in this loss of the Araucaria forest, which is more of a southern interior forest type of Paraná pines, essentially. So it's this type of pine tree. You can see even in the 1880s, they were being exploited and destroyed to be used for paper pulp. It has an incredibly fabulous pulp for paper making and was quite popular. So what's interesting is that those photographs from the 1880s with black men who are likely slaves, there's still slavery in Brazil until 1889, is interesting when you compare this with the current exploitation in the Amazon, where legally, in fact, the forestry code stipulates that you cannot cut down the Brazil nut tree, but you can cut down everything else, and then graze cattle. So you can see the cows kind of dispersed in this coivara situation of cutting and burning of the forest floor. The last example that I'll give of this kind of multinational approach to Amazon exploitation is the one that, in fact, provokes Burle Marx's speech to the Senate in 1976. Wolfgang Sauer, seen on the left, is a German who has actually been living in Brazil for some time as the head of Volkswagen do Brasil. He creates this initiative, although Volkswagen is headquartered in Sao Paulo and producing cars for Brazil at an incredible rate, thanks to the embrace of Kubitschek and other presidents. What's fascinating is he decides as an initiative, because there are so many incentives from the government, he'd like to open up a cattle ranch in the Amazon, and he does that in 1973. So you can see here, the headquarters are down in Sao Paulo, but he creates the VW Ranch up in the Vale do Rio Cristalino up in the state of Pará in the Amazon basin. Here's a view of the Volkswagen factory in Sao Paulo. This is a very young Sauer on the left with President Kubitschek in Brasilia, and Kubitschek riding in convertible Volkswagen Bug. But this is the new frontier of cows, such the headline reads here, that in fact perhaps the better thing to do in the Amazon, it's postulated, as this agricultural endeavor is not necessarily tree plantations, but it's cattle, and this will produce both nourishment and protein, but also another way to exploit that vast empty territory. So Sauer purchases a territory that's about 150,000 hectares. It's over 500 square miles in Pará, and the forest code at the time stipulates that you can deforest half of that legally, which he proceeds to do in order to produce this VW ranch, complete with cowboys and t-shirts and a logo, well adapted. This kind of practice continues in Brazil, but what's very fascinating about this moment in the early 70s and the failure of what will become the failure of the Cristalino Ranch is that Burleigh Marx has read an article in the newspaper that, in fact, Skylab, if you remember Skylab, scientists from America had sent a message to Brasilia saying that they'd seen a massive forest fire in the Amazon, and was the government aware of this? And when Burleigh Marx goes to the Senate in 1976, he cites that data and says that the Brazilian, that Sauer, in fact, that Volkswagen do Brasil, has created the greatest fire in the history of humanity in the Amazon forest. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but he doesn't care. As you may have noticed, he is very bold, and he just takes no prisoners when he makes these comments. So I'll read to you just a little bit of what he, after his speech, in fact, he gets a letter from Sauer's PR people saying, do you mind rescinding that data? You said it was the size of Lebanon. It's actually not that big. So he says, under no circumstances whatsoever will I rescind my statement, and this is why. And here's a little bit of some words from Burleigh Marx. I will never make such a denial. I don't believe in selective trained fires. In addition to weeds, it is likely that the fire also burned noisy macaws, filthy armadillos, vicious jaguars, venomous snakes, certainly large trees, and perhaps even some treacherous Indian. Do you know that the shrubs and other types of forest that you mentioned were objects of admiration and fascination for such illustrious Germans as Martius and Humboldt, who traveled to the Amazon in the 19th century? And by 1810, Martius, outraged, denounced the massacre of such precious flora. You have to understand that it's my obligation to oppose everything that I consider an ecological crime. The sacrifice of nature is irreversible. So in many ways, he's both angry and responding to this demand from Volkswagen to rescind his deposition to the Senate, but he also makes this incredible argument in defense of nature and the Amazon itself. I think it's a very powerful moment. He's essentially categorizing the Fazenda Cristalino fire as ecological genocide and placing himself in a long history of exploitation in the Amazon. So we heard quite a bit about the sitio. These are a few period photographs from the 1950s of Burleigh Marx's, what I argue is a botanical garden, his research station. He had an area of the sitio called the Sombral, where he collected plants from the Amazon and brought them to his, and from all over Brazil, and brought them to his sitio and actually housed them in this shade structure. There's no need for a greenhouse in Brazil, but they actually do need to recreate understory conditions, which he does here and throughout the sitio. And this is Burleigh Marx within that Sombral tending the plants. It's not many years later, so after the deposition, he actually does the very first of his expeditions to the Amazon in 1983. And a few of these images, which you'll see around in the exhibition as well, ironically in a Volkswagen van, which I'm sure you were driving one of these maybe, and camping in hammocks strung between the vans. We see, in fact, this plant collecting expedition to the Amazon, where I think Burleigh Marx is actually able to visit firsthand what he's seeing in terms of this is the collecting and pressing of plant specimens, the impacts of building a highway through the Amazon, the erosive impact of that roadway. And I think when you think about the extent, this is the BR 230, also known as the Trans-Amazonian Highway. The impact of that is directly related to deforestation because, of course, having a road makes it very easy to illegally timber or to pull out or expand soybean farms or ranches. So we see the red, this is through 2016, but you can actually trace the line of the highway through this diagram. And satellite imagery, actually not unlike Skylab, we can now start to use much more precise satellite imagery to determine what are the impacts of this deforestation along that highway road. And where are farms and legal, often, soybean farms and other farming initiatives and ranching initiatives in the Amazon where they are occurring. So, and you know, there are actually still uncontacted tribes that live within, this is an Acre, this is an aerial drone view of an unknown, uncontacted tribe. So not only is this an incredibly rich and biodiverse forest for plants and animals, but there are in fact cultures that are as of yet untouched within it. So who owns the Amazon? It's a very interesting question. Brazil certainly has the largest area of rainforest in the world. So you can see just in these numbers of hectares. Of course, some of the other names down here, Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, and Ecuador also share a significant portion of the Amazon rainforest. And then I think the other fascinating thing, and where Burleigh Marx actually makes his major point in his 1976 deposition, is that in fact the control of the Amazon should not be with the Ministry of Agriculture, as it was at that time, since the military dictatorship moved it there. But he said there had to be something new, there had to be a Ministry of the Environment, which in fact is not formed until 1989. But once you hit 1989, you actually start to see how forest politics are connected. And we see a drop in the deforestation rate, another spike, again, these are all politically produced. And then in the 2000s, there's another spike of illegal harvesting of hardwoods, which then becomes regulated and controlled. And you can actually see that Brazil is doing a very good job until 2014, and then we're starting to see a rise. 2015, I don't have 16 and 17 here, but you know that they're continuing upward. This just puts some of those numbers into areas, again, just from 2004 through 12, where you start to see that decline, which is quite significant. But again, these kinds of graphings of highs and lows have very serious implications. And we know, of course, with the ongoing policies of Bolsonaro and Trump also, there's a dismantling of environmental protections. And actually, very early in Jair Bolsonaro's presidency, he returned the protection of the Amazon, took it away from the environment and gave it back to the Ministry of Agriculture. And 3 days ago, Reuters produced a report that, in fact, the data on the area of deforestation for the month of May of this year was the highest it had been in the last decade. So we're seeing very quickly, and of course, this is the first month after the rainy season in which forestry, deforestation and cutting is occurring again. So we know that we're on perhaps another spike. And so it's very critical for us to really think about what did Burleigh Marx do? How was he successful? How did he take no prisoners? And how can we actually start to exemplify some of his qualities in today's world? Thank you.
Hello, good morning. My name is Isabella Ono. I would like to thank the invitation of New York Botanical Garden and have the opportunity to share with you our purpose and the challenge of to create a new institute. I would like to thank especially Carrie Barrett, Edward Sullivan that visit us in the studio, Raymond Jungles, that is our old friend, Catherine that's doing a very good job in this new book, and Joanna Groke that makes this happen. Brazil is a very rich country in natural resources and have a spectacular landscape and nature. And from this place, there is one person that enriched the cities and the world of arts, Roberto Burle Marx. He was one of the most important landscape architects in the 20th century. And I was lucky to have him in my childhood. I will tell a little about my experience. When I was born in 1974, my father, Haruyoshi Ono, was already his partner and friend for 10 years. I was surrounded by his whole atmosphere of the sitio, the state where he used to live, and the studio. At that age, everything was simple and sophisticated, as natural could be, and Roberto was like that. He was intense, curious. He could develop a very well-done garden or artwork for a special client, and he can cook delicious food in the weekends lunch time for his friends, but at the same time, everything was simple, with no luxury in his house and in his life. At the time, I didn't realize how rich was this experience to grow up so close of such a strong person, a real genius. Somehow, I was already overtaken by his ideals, and today I realized that Burle Marx and Haruyoshi influence was so strong for me that it's natural for me to become a landscape architect. I can say Haruyoshi was one of the important persons in the preservation of Burle Marx's legacy. During my life, I saw him working with Roberto with very responsibility, devotion, and respect. It was a beautiful partnership. In my point of view, they are opposite, but at the same time, complementary. Burle Marx was the artist, the extrovert, and Haru was very detailed, perfectionist, Japanese, like introvert. They worked together for 30 years, and Haruyoshi was partner in such famous projects such Copacabana Beach, and he was involved also in some art productions like engraving, ceramic panels, sculpture for plants. Haruyoshi never called himself a disciple of Burle Marx. For him, it's not important to be famous to have been working with Burle Marx. He was concerned to preserve, to continue working using his teachings, and through his concept, to disseminate his legacy. Also, he was responsible for the organization and the maintenance of all the landscape archives, and after Burle Marx passed away, he was the most relevant person that collaborated in all important exhibitions and publications of Burle Marx's work. More than show us how to perceive the landscape and how to work in the landscape field, he taught us about the importance of Burle Marx's contribution and the urgency to work on the preservation of the archive. He believes that Burle Marx's ideals had a lot to contribute to our world. An important concept of Burle Marx was the curiosity to experiment and the openness to learn and exchange knowledge. He had a pleasure to teach and to learn, and he shared those values with my father during their lives. Like Burle Marx, Haruyoshi always encouraged those who want to learn more about Burle Marx's work, and he was always available and put his studio open for those who wish to learn more. He transmitted to us this commitment to share his concepts and the responsibility to preserve Burle Marx's archive, that is an important part of the 20th century history. Burle Marx's concepts of art and environmental preservation are current today, and it's an inspiration to the actual and future generation. About 3 years ago, we started to talk about the future of the archives, but when my father passed away 2 years ago, we decided to start working with more focus and create a non-profit institute that could deal with the preservation and also proactively start to raise awareness of the importance of Burle Marx's contribution in the world. With his hard work and dedication of Haruyoshi, he was the seed of Burle Marx Institute that I will present today. Just a little about the story of Burle Marx. He was born in 1909. He was a Brazilian landscape designer, but not architect. He went for the School of Fine Art in Rio. He was the fourth son of Cecilia Burle, a Brazilian woman, and Wilhelm Marx, a German Jewish. He was one of the greatest artists of our time. He was restless, visionary, unique. In the 30s, he started a dialogue with intellectual group and became part of the exponent of Brazilian modernists. At that time, to be modernist was to be nationalist, to be a lover of Brazilian culture, avant-garde. He transported landscape design to a logic of plastic art in aesthetic perception, using texture, shadow, volumes, color to transform the space. As a crystal, he was a multiple artist. Modern landscape, he was a painter, sculptor, designed jewelry, costumes for theaters, scenery sets. But as a landscape architect, he transformed landscape into an art form and believed that garden is a planned organization of natural elements. Much of his work has a sense of timeless and perfection. Burle Marx preferred to work on public spaces. In his word, it provides democratic spaces where the citizens can feel they are part of the cities with dignity. He was interested in doing projects that could bring joy and art for all, an art that would promote meetings and be part of the people's daily lives. He has generosity to plan spaces for the future generations, anticipating the development of the spaces and the humans' lives. His art work is alive. It's a work in process, and the time completes the idea. He was one of the first who used native plants in public gardens. For example, this first drawing is from the 30s in Recife, in the northeast of Brazil, where he brought native plants for a public place. Another example was this garden in Rio. In the 50s, he introduced a Brazilian tree from the north of Brazil called Palmolato, Scalicophyllum prussianum, for an aristocratic house in Rio that used to be the capital of Brazil, showing us that the primitive can be sophisticated and that it's possible to test, to take some risks, and to be audacious, using some species that can be considered minor to a luxury project. At that time, Brazilian garden was copied from Europe, but Burle Marx changed that, and more than that, create a new language of contemporary landscape word design. He was a precursor of themes such as preservation, participating in series of lecture and discussions, as Catherine brought us today. He began to take excursions in Brazil forests with botanists and other professions to study the relationship between the different groups of plants and to understand the natural landscape. Most of these expeditions the most important was to Amazon in 1983, where the group crossed the whole country. And he was not just a theorist doing lectures in Brazil and abroad. He really became engaged with the cause. For example, during a highway construction in Brazil, he used to get his truck to save some plants and brought them to his nursery at Sítio, the state where he used to live. He was one of the first to call for conservation of Brazilian forests and to speak out against the deforestation. In these excursions, the group discovered several new plants. At least 21 have his name. Sítio was his living laboratory. In 1949, he acquired the estate at Barra de Guaratiba, and because he loved to study and observe the development of the plants, he established there his house, his nursery, and his plant collection. In 1985, he decided to donate for the Brazilian government, and now it belongs to the National Heritage Institute. Nowadays, the Sítio is running for a candidate for the World Heritage by UNESCO. Sítio and the Burle Marx Institute that I will bring today are partners in the mission to preserve the Burle Marx legacy. I brought a brief panorama of the Burle Marx landscape contribution. He developed more than 2,000 projects in Brazil and abroad. In Brazil, almost the whole country, he did some gardens, like Copacabana Beach, a Safra Bank, it's a terrace in São Paulo. And around the world, UNESCO, headquartered in UNESCO in Paris, that he developed in the 60s. And one of his last projects in Malaysia in the beginning of the 90s. And of course, Miami in Biscayne Boulevard. With all this production, Burle Marx Institute is born to echo the art of this genius. In 2018, we created the Institute with the purpose of preserving his landscape collections and disseminate his ideal and values. We truly believe that his legacy has a worldwide relevance and it's an inspiration. And our goal is to improve the discussion about his work and make the information and the archive public to share it. Our mission is to preserve, catalyze, and disseminate the legacy of Burle Marx to inspire and stimulate new initiatives. And our vision is to be the center of reference of Burle Marx's work and through actions promote the essence of his ideals. The archives have more than 2,000 developed projects, nationally and internationally. Just to give a panorama, we have more than 10,000 drawings, sketches, photographs, and we put together the Haruyoshi collection with the studio collection open for the public. And here's some images of the drawings that we have, a lot of sketches. Here's the first drawings of gardens that Burle Marx made in the beginning of the 30s. And for example, the tapestry was made for São Paulo, but all the drawings belongs to this collection. And the models of the projects, and all the painting plans of the landscape project that they developed. And another part, there is a lot of letters, documents, photos. Haruyoshi photographs all 30 years of Burle Marx works in paintings, gardens, sculptures, so everything, excursions, everything was there in the photos. And of course, we have old clippings of newspapers, magazines, historical papers. And since the beginning, the studio was involved in the promotion of Burle Marx's work. We were all the time consulted for research, exhibitions, publications, lectures. And the studio used to receive internship landscape architects like Raymond Jungles, and to learn more about and to visit some gardens. We were already working to share Burle Marx's perspective, that is culture, education, and environment. But now, with the creation of the Institute, our aim is to focus and to be more proactive and to have more resources to be able to reverberate Burle Marx's values and knowledge. Burle Marx Institute was created because there is urgency to preserve the archive and to celebrate his contribution. We realize that it's a challenge to maintain the collection without a team focus and without researches. Here is some exhibition that we helped in visit gardens that we used to do, and researches and some publications and lectures about this. It's important to tell that in Brazil we don't have the culture to preservation historical heritage. And nowadays in Brazil, the investment in culture, educational, and environmental has reduced a lot. So, but on the other hand, we have a growing demand and a fragile material. And so our challenge is to preserve and reverberate it. We are We are now in the pioneer phase, putting structure in the Institute and in all the process. We developed a business plan for 3 years with the aim of both preserve and disseminate this legacy. We are working on the first actions, look for funds to help in the structuring the Institute, for organize and digitalize archives, and in the future have a public database, and to help in the development of new projects such as new exhibitions, workshops, talks that will promote Burle Marx' legacy. Our goal is in the next 3 years is to get resources to maintain the collection and to construct a solid structure with a basic staff to be able to open for those who wish to learn more about it. And we have a unique collection of these important artists. So it's important to bring light to this story and to enrich the discussion about Burle Marx, but also about art, landscape, history, environmental, and nature. I brought two sentences of Burle Marx that are very relevant for me. I'm not afraid of making mistakes. Mistakes we can correct. I'm afraid of formulas. If I were to do a perfect thing, I would not ever try to start. What is important is to have the curiosity. And the other one is, it's true that the art of gardening did not begin with me, nor will it end with me. But I believe that my experience can be useful to those who wish to come after me. It showed me that we have to take some risks to have curiosity, to keep going. As a landscape architect, that is somehow putting my business on hold, it's not easy, and it's a real challenge to be here and to do a non-profit organization, especially in Brazil nowadays. When my father passed away 2 years ago in an accident, I realized that I would be not here forever. So we have the responsibility to leave things for the next generations, to plant seeds like Burle Marx did, because we have a treasure that have to be explored in the future. Fortunately, we started to have some institutional partnership that are giving a technical support, such as JIP, that's in non-profit organization, Tattoo Design, that kindly is doing our visual identity, Vieira Rezende, that is doing our legal support, and we started with Instituto Moreira Salles, a very well-known cultural institute, in a technical cooperation with the photos. So I would like to thank you, everybody, for listening to me, and I cannot go on this journey alone. So it's important to have more people aligned with the cause. We are a new institute, and it will be a pleasure to talk about it, and to her, and have some suggestions about it. Thank you very much.
Are there questions or comments that are burning from your mind?
Hi, I was looking at your architecture, Raymond, in Florida, and my little experience of Florida is that it's very, very hot, and that in these modern, beautiful buildings, it is very, very cold. And the amount, because of the air conditioning, and the amount of current that it must take to cool them must be huge. And I always thought, I think it was back in the 80s or 90s, why don't they put solar panels along these buildings to collect the much available sunshine of the Sunshine State to cool these buildings, and if they didn't cool them quite so much, maybe people would not shudder on going out of them, and you would see them walking in your gardens. Thank you.
Well, you know, the original architecture in Florida there was no air conditioning. It was designed for the climate, and you'd find the same thing throughout the Caribbean. Everybody had cisterns, everybody had large overhangs, and there was always ventilation coming through the buildings. I think it's the same problem whether you're in Florida or most other places that get warm. Like Atlanta, I'm sure it'd be tough to live there in the summer without air conditioning. But I agree with you, because it's often the disparity from the interior and the exterior is tremendous.
That's why I try to spend as much time outside as I can. But to tell you the truth, if I was working on my drawings without air conditioning, they'd be a mess. So I don't have a solution for that. I know that in the Caribbean, a lot of my clients are doing solar panels and building cisterns, even though many people say it's not a good return on investment. That you catch the water in the rainy season, but then when you really need it, it's the dry season, and you're not getting any rain to be able to do it. So that's an argument. Many people are still doing the cisterns, and I don't have all the environmental solutions, but we are in trouble in the world, that's for sure. But planting a lot of trees is a good start.
Good. Thank you. Right here in the third row.
Thank you so much. A question regarding where he learned. Who was he inspired by, and how it was, and putting him in context in a global scale, what other potential artists of his stature do you believe also have influenced the landscape?
Isabel, do you want to take that up? Some of the influences in the other artists, garden architects or others before Burleigh Marx, from whom he worked or who he admired.
He was a student of Portinari. It's a painter, a Brazilian painter, so he was very influenced for his art. And of course, as Burleigh Marx was very curious, he all the time had lots of persons together. And as I told, he was involved with all the Modernism movements, so all the artists and intellectuals of that time, so they changed a lot of information. So.
And it's also important to realize that Burleigh Marx began as a singer, because he comes from a very musical family, as I indicated, and that was his first series of lessons. And then he went, as Isabella said, to study with the artist Cândido Portinari, who was one of the key figures in the 1920s Sao Paulo movement of modernism. There was actually a moment called the Week of Modern Art in February 1922, which was sort of ground zero for a complete transformation of the Brazilian art scene. And people like Tarsila do Amaral, whose great exhibition was at MoMA a year ago, Portinari, G. Cavalcanti, and many others who were pushing back against the classicism that had been very much in the Portuguese-French heritage in Brazil of the 19th century. So he comes from lots and lots of different sources. Catherine, do you want
I
to...
can speak a little to the landscape history that influenced him, particularly in Brazil. There's this Portuguese-French connection is really important. And in fact, there was an imperial landscape architect, actually under Pedro II, who came to Brazil, I would say probably around 1850 or so, and designed a number of public gardens for the city of Rio, which incorporated native plants, sinuous curves. It was very much the jardin l'esprit anglais, like the English garden in the French style, by a Frenchman who came to Brazil at the invitation of the Portuguese emperor and brought this tradition and this new kind of excitement about working with tropical flora. I think he also went on a number of expeditions in the interior, as did Marx before him and also Burleigh Marx after him. And so in many ways, they were both connecting the beauty of the Brazilian country to its public spaces. And I think he was an incredible influence on Burleigh Marx as a landscape architect as well.
And if you want to know more about that, you should buy the book Depositions, because there's an amazing amount of information in there. Yeah. I personally heard him speak about Debussy as one of his favorite musicians, and also about an exhibition he saw in Europe of Van Gogh's work for the first time, and he was blown away by that.
We have a question here on your right.
Mm-hmm. My question is for Isabella. Isabella, where is the Institute Burleigh Marx planning to house his work for people to go see? And how do people in the United States can be part of the creation of this institute?
Sorry, the first question is?
Where is it physically, and how will people see it?
In the beginning, we will stay close to the archive in the studio, and there is one floor dedicated for the institute. And the idea is, when we have more resources, is to have our own studio, our own space. And what the other question?
Your funders.
Yes, we already create. There is an institute that are open, and I'm open for any kind of help or support. So.
Perhaps creating as part of the Institute, something called the Friends of Burleigh Marx International group that exists for many other institutions. That would be, I think, and you can all become friends of Burleigh Marx, and that's, I think, something that should be done.
Yeah, because we have a lot of material to be explored, like I said, so it's important to join in this.
Indeed, we have time for one more comment or question before we adjourn.
Right here,
Just to give one time.
What interactions with North American or European artists might he have had, or even other landscape architects?
It's an interesting question about Burleigh Marx in the United States. He actually did not come to the United States until the 1940s, and then he came as a fully formed garden architect, and most of his interactions with the U.S. art world were through the garden world. And, for example, he had a particularly strong relationship with the University of Pennsylvania and with architects in Philadelphia. That's why there is a good deal of his work in private collections as well as in the University of Pennsylvania. But I don't really know of any American visual artists that he was interacting with.
But he had contact with Ekbo and Halprin, so from here, from the United States. So has a lot of letters that they change with each other. So it's interesting to start to research in all this material because we found a lot of things.
And that's why the Institute has to continue its existence, just to document all of these things. There are over 2,000 letters of Burleigh Marx that have not really been investigated. There's one architectural historian right now, Guilherme Matzo Dourado, who's doing work in the archives, and I think once it is up and running, there will be many more possibilities to answer the questions that you so interestingly posed.
I know that Calder was a house guest and was a friend of his, as was Corbusier.
Yeah.
And you probably know of many
Richard
more from your
Neutra, he
research.
worked with
Neutra.
as well.
So I guess Ian McHarg and Conrad Hammerman, two architects in the Philadelphia area as well. So all of these international links, I think, will, because of exhibitions like the MoMA in '93, the Jewish Museum in 2016, our exhibition, will, we hope, stimulate more and more curiosity for Burleigh Marx in a very broad panorama. So let's hope that it has its reverberations. Shelby, did you have one last comment to make?
No, I have a question for Raymond. Did he draw his
I'll repeat the question.
I wanted to know how did you work, you saw him in the studio, did he draw plans? What sort of documentation did he make?
So let me just repeat the question.
Well, I can repeat it. Shelby's asking me, I was able to go there quite often. How did I see Roberto work? Well, I saw Roberto painting almost every weekend, and the house was open for people. He always liked to paint on one loggia or the other, depending whether he was doing painted fabrics, of which he had people assist him, or the acrylic on canvas, of which he did by himself on one particular loggia. People could go watch him if they wanted, but he didn't like it when people commented when he was painting. He told me once some gentleman told him that he liked it better before when he was working there, which really infuriated him. But I saw him go, one of the things that impressed me the most was in his studio. He went, even in the traffic, almost every day in the weekday to the studio. But he was sort of like a hummingbird. He'd go from one desk to the other, and he'd spend time with people, and he'd sketch, and he'd talk, and he'd converse, and he led that way. I never saw him in his house working on a landscape drawing, for instance. But that was, I only started going down in 1982. But he was very much of the leader of the studio, and he had Haru Yoshiono, of course, who basically ran the whole studio and was very hands-on, and as you said, very meticulous, and their drawings were just incredible. They used to draw on a mylar with actually acrylic paint on the back, so their blueprints, which were beautiful, were works of art, the originals, and I assume you have all those originals as well.
And I remember when I was a child, I never worked with Burle Marx because when I was born, I was like a little girl. But I saw them working together, and it was amazing because he's very, like a son, so getting in the office and always this energy, and he draw and discuss with all the team. So might be very funny. So.
I spoke to one of his associates in Caracas, John Stoddard, who was actually an Englishman who came to work in the earlier iteration of the office, and he was describing another gentleman in the office who would make the gouache plans, and they would paint these beautifully drawn pencil on paper, and then color them with gouache. And he described the meticulous nature of painting all of the colors of the gouache and then the use of a hair dryer at an appropriate angle to air dry the gouache. And as he was working, it was one person in the office whose task was to paint those amazing gouaches that we now see in the MoMA collection, in your collection. They're incredible. So you can see live Burleigh Marx at the MoMA anytime. So that's a really nice thing to always go take a look.
Yeah, Verpatograph on Mylar, and I mean, it took forever to dry. I actually tried it a couple times, but I gave up.
So I think what has been the takeaway, as they say, of this morning's symposium is to evoke Burleigh Marx in all of his extraordinary preoccupations, desires, his immense creativity, and I can only imagine he is floating in this room with us. He is here, his energy is here, and we should applaud him as well as our speakers. Thank you so much.